And these. What's that?
I just started recording it. It's fine. Go ahead.
Go ahead. The speaker tonight is Willa Bywater, and she's from Belfast. She's a sophomore at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. And she's a history buff with a passion and interest in Maine history. She's worked for the Penobscot Marine Museum for several summers and interned at the Belfast Historical Society. She was named the best social studies student in her graduating class in Belfast area high, and planning on a major in history or anthropology at college. Last semester she took college. She took a class at Haverford College called The Age of Jefferson and Jackson. And for her final assignment, she researched a journal from 1839 kept by one William Parrott, who was stationed at Fort Fairfield in Aroostook, obviously, after the Aroostook War. And she wrote a paper about the war's significance to existing scholarship on the Aroostook War and on the borderlands and the unique nature of the conflict. She believes this journal sheds light on a very underexplored part of Maine history and on some of the aspects of the Aroostook War that make it worth further scholarly study. She prepared this presentation to highlight the journal and its importance. So she's going to tell us about the war. I will tell you locally, when the governor called out the militia, all the militia units from Robinson and Charlotte and Pembroke and Giles, and they all mustered here because it was the closest large city to Aroostook, frankly, and they mustered here. There were several hundred of them, and had they been ordered, they would have marched to, well, I'd say up the road. There wasn't any road. I mean, it would have been through trails, mostly, and it would have taken. It's 96 miles from here to Holden, and it would take us some time to get there, especially the artillery units, and they had an artillery unit and plenty of horses. And while they were mustered here, our enemies crossed the river, because obviously the argument was between the United States of America and England, British North America. So people from over there on the Canadian side in St. Stephen, they were watching carefully from the higher buildings up there, observing every move that the militia was making and sending information back to the authorities and intelligence people on the British side. So they knew what was going on in Calais, and I think I sent an email, and they reported that the militia in Calais they were all starving, and people were dying, and it looked pretty bleak.
Funerals on the street.
Yeah, which was all denied by the Calais Times, the Calais advertisement. So Calais had to actually been a serious conflict. All these militias would have gone up there and fought in that conflict, but thankfully it was resolved by the diplomats and in a way that I think was satisfactory to most people. So that said, I will turn it over to our presenter tonight.
All right, it's all you.
All right, thank you all so much for having me. Here, can I share my screen? Yes, there we go. Let me put that in full screen. Okay. Hello. Wait, go back. Okay. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm really excited to be doing this presentation. And thank you for the lovely introduction. As mentioned, I am going to Bryn Mawr College. I did the school presentation or school research project last year. The paper was that we had to do a primary source from 1830s to 1850s America. Primary source as in a first-hand account of something that happened during that time. I really wanted to do something on Maine. And when I consulted the teachers and the librarians, they were like, I don't know of anything that was happening in Maine during that time. And I was like, I'm sure something must have happened. So I did some digging and I ended up learning about the Aroostook War and then finding this journal, which is on the main digital repository in property of the Maine Historical Society archives. It is entirely scanned and uploaded online for free. You can view it for free, and there's also transcription. It is from 1839. It's written by William P. Parrott. It's at Fort Fairfield and during the Aroostook War, or technically right after the Aroostook War. We'll get to that in a bit. I did, in addition to reading the journal, I also did transcription work on the journal. I did a ton of contextual research. I found out there's very little existing work about the Aroostook War, like really a handful of articles, and a lot of it comes up in like longer things about Canadian-American relations. But I got really invested in the project, partially because it's Maine and I love Maine, and partially because I came to the conclusion after reading the journal that I felt it really said something about the nature of humanity and tendency to war or tendency away from war. And again, stick around for the end and we'll get to that. But I also primarily, I had a lot of fun. And in writing the essay, I had to conform to historical scholarly writing standards, which are a little bit dry. So I felt that in the final essay, although I was proud of it, didn't really convey how much fun I found reading this journal to be. And so that's sort of what I'm really aiming for in this presentation, is to have you all come with me on this journey, learn about history, and have fun doing it. So, context. It's the 1830s. Many things are happening. Out in the West, the frontiers are being expanded at considerable loss of life, and Manifest Destiny is happening. There is the Texas War of Independence is happening, and up in Maine, a very different frontier and a very different border war is happening. This area that I am pointing to with my cursor, outlined between, you can see the cursor, right?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, the area that I'm pointing to with my cursor here, this is the disputed territory between Maine and New Brunswick. It's a huge swath of land and no one knows who it belongs to. You might be wondering, how do we let this happen? Well, in 1783, we drew up the treaty for the end of the Revolutionary War. We settled the border between the newly independent colonies and the still British colonies of Canada. However, in settling the northeastern boundary, they chose for their markers the St. Croix River and the Highlands of Nova Scotia. There are two problems with this. Number one, the Highlands of Nova Scotia were a poorly defined thing because what exactly a Highlands is unclear. Number two, there was no river at the time that was actually called the St. Croix River. One of the many, many people who tried to survey this land and find the boundary over the years famously said in frustration that every river was a St. Croix River because the French loved to put crosses on rivers to mark them. So this went on for a very long time. People kept getting hired to try and settle the boundary. Either New Brunswick would reject, or Nova Scotia would reject it, or Maine would reject it. At the time that we are discussing, this green line is the claim that Maine had. This red line is the claim that New Brunswick had. And this yellow line, which is sort of the closest to what the actual Maine boundary looks like today, is the compromise line that was proposed by the King of the Netherlands. He was called in to intervene at one point, which I think really goes to show just how wildly long this went on. They had to call in a neutral party, and apparently the King of the Netherlands didn't have anything else going on. So he proposed this line. Neither side would take it, and he went back to the Netherlands, probably thinking this is a very silly country and I hope they don't talk to me again. So the reason why things start to reach a boiling point around the 1820s is multifold. First of all, the Maine is independent now. It's separated from Massachusetts, and like a lot of people who have just gone through a separation, society just wants to take some time to focus on its own problems. What's important to Maine? What's important to Maine is settling the border with those damn Canadians. Second of all, timber trespass. This is a big issue. The main thing the disputed territory has going for it is that there's a lot of great lumber up there. People want to harvest this lumber. You have to get a permit to harvest lumber on public lands. It's hard to do that if you don't know which governmental body you are trying to get the permit from. So there's a lot of accusations going back and forth of like, this man was illegally harvesting timber without a permit. He says, no, I have a permit. It's from New Brunswick. They say, well, this is Maine's territory. He says, I thought it was New Brunswick's territory. This goes back and forth a lot. People are accusing each other of harvesting timber on lands that they had the permits to harvest on. And then as a third note, people live there now. For a while, there wasn't really any permanent settlements. It was mostly just lumberjacks who would go in and out with the seasons. But there are now permanent settlements in a few different places, small towns that don't really have names yet. But they want to incorporate as towns. And again, they can't do that if they can't decide whether they're going to incorporate as a town of New Brunswick or a town of Maine. Yes, this is a recorded problem. There's at least 2 different towns that had to hold town hall meetings to vote on which country they wanted, or which state/province they wanted to incorporate as. And this also made things confusing for censuses. So it's important to note that this was not actually a war by most definitions, which is part of why it doesn't get covered as much in history. War was never formally declared. In the winter of 1838 to 1839, things did reach a tipping point. Arrests occurred. There was a whole series of shenanigans wherein the Maine land agent went up to try and arrest the New Brunswick land agent, but then the Maine land agent got arrested instead. This caused outcry on both sides. Militias were mobilized, as we discussed, and marshaled. But Maine did not have the power to declare war. New Brunswick did not have the power to declare war. And while they both wanted to go to war, Britain and the US did not want to go to war. They had had the revolution, they had had the War of 1812, they were both dealing with other stuff happening. They did not need a third war on their hands. So, eventually, the government stepped in and made a temporary truce agreement until the border could be settled once and for all. The terms of the truce agreement, as far as I've been able to figure, are that Maine would get control of the Aroostook River Valley, New Brunswick would get control of the St. John River Valley, and everybody had to recall their militias and calm down. And that's where we stand in April of 1839, which is when the journal starts. So that truce was made in, I think, February of 1839, and the journal picks up in early April. William P. Parrott, he is a land agent, which is essentially a federal government worker, or not federal, state government worker in this case, who is in charge of overseeing the care of the public lands. So land owned by the state, which at this point encompasses some of the disputed territory. They don't know how much, but whatever parts of it belong to Maine are under the purview of the land agent. The head land agent of Maine is Rufus McIntyre, who is sort of William Parrott's boss, and a lot of the letters in the journal are addressed to him. Parrot is stationed at Fort Fairfield, which is right along here on the Aroostook River. It is technically a guarded fort built in case of Canadian attack, but it's also currently being used as a timber boom. I say currently to the journal, being used as a timber boom for people to pass the logs down the river. William's responsibilities here are manifold. He's there to keep track of the timber that is harvested and sold and passed down the river. He is there to ensure the safety of the public lands. He wants to make sure everything's on the level, and that nobody is illegally harvesting timber. That would be very bad. This also means, since he is a land agent in charge of the public lands, he is in charge of defending Maine's claims to the public lands and making sure nobody steals from them. But also, kind of, he's there to keep the peace. He doesn't seem to be quite sure whether he's there to keep the peace or whether he's there to fight. And also, they're building a road. The Holton Road, from Holton to towns like this one is under construction while all of this is happening because they need a way to get supplies and potentially soldiers up to Holton in case, again, of further attack. So all of this is happening, and William is keeping this journal. It's physically, it is a book. It contains, it seems like he basically, whenever he would write a letter to somebody or receive a letter, he would copy it down in the journal. So I talk a lot about letters in the presentation. When I'm talking about are the copied letters in the journal. And he also does actual journal entries and keeps track of various transactions, occurrences, legal proclamations and such that are made. Just generally does a really good job keeping records, which is super important, and I'm very glad he did. Also, as a quick sidebar, the character of William Parrott that we can, can understand from this journal, mostly seems to be that he's very confused. He's very far from home. He is physically isolated from the sources of authority and reason, like the sheriff and his boss, Rufus McIntyre, which is who he addresses a lot of the letters to. And he often is asking Rufus McIntyre for permission on basically anything. He's like, if you agree with this, I will send out this proclamation. Let me know if you think it's a bad idea. And as a college student, I found this very relatable because I was also very stressed and confused and far from home. And so that's why throughout this, although it's not quite in line with academic standards, I keep calling him William because it just feels weird to call him Parrot at this point. It's like, that's my friend William. So if you're wondering why, that's why. Okay, so cast of characters. William P. Parrott. Rufus McIntyre, please answer my letters. The main guy, we've talked about him. I couldn't find much information on who he was outside of this. I know that he worked at the land agent's office for a few years, both before and after this. And that's honestly pretty much all I can tell you. It was really hard to find other records of who he was or what he did. Rufus McIntyre, on the other hand, actually has his own Wikipedia page. And he was the main land agent of Maine, the head land agent of Maine. That's less confusing. And was 70 years old at the time that this was happening and still decided to go up to Canada to try and arrest the land agent himself, which is pretty cool. He doesn't actually, we never actually see his replies to William. We don't know what he said back, which is interesting. But he's a more well-documented guy. There's the Maine militia and volunteers. That is an actual headline, Maine and her soil or blood. Headline in a Maine newspaper of the time. The New Brunswick militia and volunteers. The lumberjacks, not all of whom, most of whom were born in either Maine or New Brunswick, but who often didn't seem to really have a strong political alignment one way or the other. The settlers, who didn't know what was happening. The Madawaska settlers, who we will cover later, but who were a community on the St. John River that was briefly sort of its own, that was sort of a neutral zone between American and British territory. And J.A. McLaughlin, who we will get to again later. He is the head land agent of New Brunswick. So, on the American side, there are some problems. So they have to dismiss the militias, but they didn't say anything about volunteer armed posses. What is a volunteer armed posse? It's a group of people with guns who volunteered. This is very similar to what a militia is, but it's a different thing. And therefore, it's definitely okay to have one. However, it takes a really long time for the militias to be dismissed. Like, we have to get the news that they've been dismissed, get all their stuff, get paid, leave. And then by the time the volunteer armed posse show up, they're not very helpful either. They mutiny twice. Once because they want molasses, which is questionable, but once for the more legitimate reason of they feel that they're not being paid fairly. And also, according to William, they answer but the purpose of scarecrows, which is to say they don't do anything. They're just there to look intimidating. And it seems like the militia, the volunteer armed posse is aware of this and frustrated. William writes in another one of his letters that they are complaining and writing back home saying, we came here to go to war and we're just standing around and helping build a road and helping pass timber through a boom. This is not what we signed up for. And eventually what this seems to culminate in is mass desertions and discharges. So this on this, why am I gesturing with my hand? On this side of the screen, you can see this is a list of men who had enlisted and are now deserting. And there are so many of them who desert on the singular day of June 22nd that William gives up writing them the word deserted down altogether and just does a tiny ditto mark. And this continues for a whole other page. There are 2 pages just of people who deserted on June 22nd. Another problem that William is facing is trouble enforcing the laws. It is the Wild West. Well, it's the wild Northeast out here. Nowhere is legally anywhere, which is to say there are no incorporated towns because they haven't figured out where to incorporate yet. None of the towns have sheriffs, police officers, judges, or anything. The closest thing is the sheriff of Penobscot County, who gets his reign expanded to what will later be Aroostook County. It's not actually Aroostook County yet. This is just the disputed territory. But that's one sheriff covering a really huge chunk of land, and he's not there most of the time. William at one point writes, Mr. Philip Brown has expressed a disinclination to accept the office of Justice of the Peace here, and we have no person qualified to act. I think it very important that some course should be taken to remedy this evil, as the want of proper officers to administer justice here is a great embarrassment. Eventually, he appoints a certain Mr. Patty as deputy sheriff, which is somewhat helpful, at least, in that he can actually do the work of a sheriff in and around Fort Fairfield. But they still have a lot of problems enforcing laws. And the main law they have trouble with getting broken is people trying to skip out on paying bonds. Remember the road that I said they were building? So that's a road the government's building. The government needs money to build roads. I'm sure you're all familiar with this problem as it is still a problem today. Government needs to get money from the citizens to pay for building the road. And in this case, the way that they're doing that is not through taxes, but through basically having people pay to have their timber passed through the boom to be marked and confirmed as legal to sell. And then the people will pay for a certain amount of timber, pick it up, and carry it to be sold. However, a lot of people end up deciding they don't want to do this. And if they can't pay for it, they have to leave the timber in the boom, which clogs up the river and makes it hard for anybody else to get their timber through. So this causes sort of a cascade of problems. And when people are pressed to try and pay back their bonds, they often end up just simply leaving. And in some cases, actually going to Canada or to the provinces rather than pay back their bonds. So, guess this is where an interesting third party enters the picture, because with so many of the people, so many of the volunteer armed posse deserting and the lumberjacks skipping town to skip out on their bonds, they end up hiring some other people to work on the road. And that is the settlers of Dubuque and Madawaska. Dubuque is or was a settlement that is right across the river from Fort Fairfield. There is no longer a town there named Dubuque, but there is, I believe, a reservation there that is named Dubuque. I also don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And as far as I can tell, this was probably a mostly English settlement. Madawaska is a slightly more interesting case. This one first arrived, or the first mention of Madawaska in the journal is from this quote from William in one of his letters to Rufus McIntyre. It says, The French people at Madawaska are in great distress for provisions and employment, and some application has been made here for assistance, which I have refused because I thought a door might be open, which it would be impossible to shut again. Could they work on that road? It would be a great help to them. This was very interesting to me when I first read it because I had never heard of Madawaska before and was sort of vaguely confused as to what it was and who these people were. And so as it turns out, after I did some more research, Madawaska is or was a settlement mostly of Acadians who had returned to the area and settled in a place that was technically not British territory, but also technically not exactly American territory. They were eventually joined by a variety of other settlers, some from various regions of Canada, some from regions of the US, but it was still a French-speaking settlement. When some people went there to, I think, take a census, they found that they had, I think, 3 churches, at least 1 schoolyard, a good amount of houses. Essentially, people were mostly subsistence farming, but it was a whole settlement that was in a neutral zone. And I think that this is what William is referring to when he says, I thought a door might be open, which it would be impossible to shut again. Essentially, he's saying it runs the risk if New Brunswick thinks that Madawaska is part of New Brunswick, it runs the risk of causing conflict. But eventually he does end up hiring some people from Madawaska to work on the roads. We know this because he later writes about getting them their wages. And it doesn't come up that much more in the journal, but I think the presence of Madawaska is just interesting in the context of the Aroostook War. And I think there's a significance to William recognizing the settlers as neutral parties, and wanting to, and both being worried about getting them involved, but also saying, like, I think would be really helpful to them, wanting to avoid causing them harm. And all of this becomes important because in September of 1839, there is an attack. Now, I am going to read a longer quote. This is directly from the journal of William, recording the attack. An attack upon this post by a large number of men from the province said to have been commanded by an officer of the militia of New Brunswick. The number of the men has been variously estimated at 50 to 60. I should judge from the appearance of the trails they made through the grain and grass that there were certainly 40 men. They attempted the attack about 3 o'clock in the morning. The night was very dark, and the sentinel, when he first discovered them, fired upon them immediately without challenging, and they all took to their heels. I understand many were injured by falling over stump logs, etc., in their retreat. Indeed, in many places they were so frightened they ran round and round. This is not exactly the most thrilling of attacks. One might describe it as something out of a Looney Tunes cartoon if one was feeling particularly ungenerous. However, it is also kind of a big deal, because if indeed the men were commanded by an officer of the militia of New Brunswick, that means New Brunswick has broken the temporary truce, and this could mean several bad things for both sides. William panics somewhat. He stops writing to Rufus McIntyre saying, "What should I do?" and starts writing to Rufus McIntyre saying, "I'm doing this now. Hope you can deal with it." He refuses to let a boat go up the river because he thinks it's going to aid the timber trespassers. And then he regrets it due to the settlers. He lets a different boat pass on the condition that it is going to aid only the settlers and not timber harvesters. And then he gets sued by the owners of the boat for illegally seizing their property because he didn't really have any authority to do that. He isn't even the head land agent of Maine. And this is very upsetting and embarrassing for him. And he writes in his journal, "This, I think, is the worst of all." However, help comes from an unexpected quarter, and that is J.A. McLaughlin, Warden of the Disputed Territory. That's right. The Canadian land agent or New Brunswick land agent writes to William and says essentially, hello, I am sorry about the attack. That was not by the militia of New Brunswick. That we did not plan that. It was random. We think that the people who did it basically got some arms from a store that is near a storage of arms that is near Fort Fairfield. We are coming by to collect them and take them into possession. Very politely, I have the honor to be your obedient humble servant, J.A. McLaughlin, Warden of the Disputed Territory. This is interesting because it's a little hard to tell because of the way that everybody in the 1800s writes, whether this is genuine politeness or whether he's being polite to as a matter of propriety, but doesn't actually mean it. However, William seems to take it at face value and writes back and says, thank you for letting me know. I have the names of some of the people who attacked the fort. I can give them to you if that would be helpful. He then gives him 2 of them in a sort of like, and more to come if you write back way, which I thought was funny. And this is where we begin to see an interesting shift in mindset in the journal. William seems to start to consider that he and J.A. McLaughlin might actually have the same goals. They might not be quite so opposed. Rather, they might both have the issue of needing to deal with the real enemy. Thus began what could have been called the greatest buddy cop movie of all time, if those existed yet, which they didn't. The real enemy, according to William, is the trespassers. They're the ones who are causing the problems. They're the ones who are causing conflict because they're the ones who are getting into fights with each other over who has the rights to be harvesting timber on whose land. Where are they getting the timber permits? It turns out some of them are from the land agent of Massachusetts. William is very upset about this because the land agent of Massachusetts should not have the ability to be giving out permits to Maine's land. Granted, Massachusetts did at the time own still an interest in Maine's land because of the terms of the separation. However, it's still a problem, and it makes it a little too easy for people to get away with fraud. What they end up finding out is that one of the people who thought he had a genuine permit got it from a guy who lived in New Brunswick who said he got the permit from the land agent of Massachusetts. This seems very sketchy. And the conclusion that William ends up coming to is that it is too hard to tell whether any of the permits are legitimate, and it's causing unnecessary conflict. So they are going to cease all timber harvesting on the disputed territory for the forthcoming winter. And he says, I am happy to be able to state that the provincial authorities have taken early and I trust efficient action in this matter, which is a compliment. And what seems to be the solution is that both J.A. McLaughlin and William Parrott are working to prevent anybody from harvesting timber on the disputed lands for the coming winter of 1839, prevent a conflict like what happened last winter. And that's where we sort of get the conclusion of the journal. It doesn't really wrap up that quite so neatly. It also doesn't really seem to clarify why the journal drops off, just stops mid-November. Maybe William was recalled. Maybe he just ran out of pages. We don't really know. He does write one thing in one of his last letters to Rufus McIntyre that I think seems like a bit of a nice way to wrap up the journal by getting to the heart of the conflict. He says, the commissioner returned to Fredericton last week. I understand they have found the Highlands. Finally, they found them. I don't know what this means. I like to imagine somebody just pointing and going, look, it's the Highlands. And everybody goes, oh yeah, those do look like the Highlands. Don't know how he missed them. They've been sitting right here the whole time. But this would not actually be the resolution to the Aroostook War. That would come several years later in 1842 with the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. which is a whole other thing that other books have been written on, so I won't get too far into it here. But the actual last entry in the journal that I do think is very sweet and makes for a somewhat more satisfying conclusion is the quote, "Mr. Warden McLaughlin has driven out all the teams on St. John's River, and I hope that the good effects which will result from this course will soon be seen." So, there's the quote. So, what did I take away from all of this? Number one, if a bunch of guys in the woods with no legal supervision and lots of guns and axes can manage to not kill each other, why can't we? By which I mean, all wars hinge on individual actions. History, like baseball, is a game of inches, for want of a nail, etc. But perhaps especially the Aroostook War is a good example of just how much individual choices can matter. If William Parrott had not taken J.A. McLaughlin's letter at face value, if J.A. McLaughlin had not written that letter to let him know that the militia of New Brunswick did not approve the attack, conflict could have resulted, people could have been killed, and things could have gone a very different direction than they actually went. The bloodless Aroostook War is bloodless because people worked to keep it that way. Maybe if people assumed good faith from each other more often, less wars would be caused over what was, in this case, seemingly a series of just very unfortunate events. The people who most wanted to fight for the border were the people who were behind the borders already. The people who knew for sure that they were part of New Brunswick were the ones who wanted to fight for New Brunswick. The people who knew for sure that they lived in Maine were the ones who wanted to fight for Maine. The people living in the disputed territory, like the people of Madawaska, the settlers of Tebeke, and William Parrott himself, mostly just wanted to keep living there. Nationalism fuels conflict. And without nationalism in a nationless space like the disputed territory, it's harder to stir up conflict if you can't know for sure which side you're on. Maybe at the end of the day, most of us just want to harvest our potatoes in peace. Thank you. And here's a picture of the actual log house, which is still up in Fort Fairfield.
Wow.
Is that still exist today?
It does, and it's actually a museum now.
Oh.
It might be a replica of the original because I don't know how long logs last, but yeah, it's still in the same place and it's a museum.
Wow.
It looks a little like the one in St. Andrews.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, are there any questions?
I thought it was interesting that they were looking for the highlands of Nova Scotia, which was quite a distance away from the headwaters of the Aroostook River, which was on the New Brunswick and Maine.
Oh, yes. Well, so at the time that the treaty was written, New Brunswick was part of Nova Scotia, or the land that is now New Brunswick was part of Nova Scotia.
Oh, it was. Okay.
Yeah, which again added to the confusion of trying to find the Highlands.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, looking at this, there were a few confusions.
Mm-hmm.
Maine had separated from Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
The question was, does Massachusetts still have some say on this land?
Mm-hmm.
Maine says no.
Mm-hmm.
And then New Brunswick is really part of Nova Scotia, which also sort of adds to the sort of fluidity of everything going on. And it really sounds interesting. This is really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, fluidity is a great word for what was going on. It also might be worth mentioning that Massachusetts, when it seemed like they might go to war, Massachusetts offered military support to Maine in the case that Maine went to war. And then Quebec actually offered military support to New Brunswick should New Brunswick go to war. So there
Wow.
were
Something. Yeah.
yeah.
I was wondering, did you get a good grade on your project?
I think so. I hope so. Yeah. I actually did not get to see my individual grade on that essay, but I got a good grade in the class. So
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
thank you.
I have to clear up one
Mhm.
issue. Historical inaccuracy. The intention is there were no casualties in this war. According to Doug Doherty, who was a historian from St. Stephen, eminent historian, who wrote an article about the war. He says, indeed, there were two casualties in the war. One, a pig, wandered across the border to Canada, and a cow shot by mistake while rustling around outside the Fort Kent block house. So I just want historically there were two, this pig and the cow died in the war.
Thank you for that. It's important to
Yeah,
honor
I
the
just wanted to
memories.
Speak again when you I have another comment to make. My last name is Churchill, and
Mhm.
my family history says that we were loyalists and that we abandoned the rabble on the American side to side with the king during the Revolution and ended up in Nova Scotia. And then my ancestors apparently, they say, moved back across to what is near Caribou now, to a place called Croix Historical, and thought that they were on English territory. They didn't want to have anything to do with the United States. They thought they were on English territory. And then this kerfluffle occurs over the border and the settlement puts them back in the United States. And that's the family history. I can tell you, I've done some research on that and it's baloney. I don't think any of this, it's not supported by any of the facts that I know about the family, but that's what the family declared. And they also declare, of course, it will relate to Winston Churchill. But that's family history.
Sounds
So,
good.
but there were people, I'm sure, who
Oh yeah.
was from New Brunswick and St. John and up there who settled over in that area, who probably thought they were still settled, they were still under the, the authority of the king and not the American government. Who
Yeah.
discovered that all of a sudden, when they settled this whole thing, that they were now back in the United States.
Yeah. And there's definitely many things that would point to that. And the Madawaska mentioned before actually ended up getting basically sliced in half by the border when it was finally settled because it was on either side of the St. John River, and that was the river that was eventually chosen as the boundary river. So there were lots of people who suddenly found themselves part of either Maine or New Brunswick, and we're not entirely sure that's where they had wanted to end up.
Yeah. No, actually, Madawaska that has a mill that crosses the river. Is that
Yeah.
Madawaska?
The paper
think
mill,
they
The
do.
yeah,
paper mill that crosses the river, yeah,
it
Yeah.
does.
yeah.
Any other questions or comments or?
No. That was fascinating.
Yes, thank you so much, Willa. That was really great.
I will make
Thank you.
another comment on the river, on the St. Croix River. She is correct that there was no St. Croix River, it was called the Scoodic.
That's
Oh,
right,
yes,
that's
right.
right.
And no one was quite sure St. Croix River was. And the governments took various positions on that. I think the US government wanted it to be the Macadavic because that would have given them more land and the British thought, well, maybe it's the Penobscot,
Right.
and they couldn't quite figure out where St. Croix was until a Canadian historian named Benoit went over to the island and started doing some excavating and found the remnants of Demont and Champlain's settlement over there.
Ah,
And that proved
Oh,
prove conclusively that the St. Croix was the river. That were mentioned, these treaties were just referring to this river and no one quite knew where it was.
That's
Um,
fascinating. I didn't know that. Yeah, you can see on the map that like each of these claims is drawn along a different river. I really like the very squiggly New Brunswick one.
Yeah. Well, the other problem with St. Croix is that it splits. There are two branches of St. Croix.
Mm-hmm.
And it was finally determined that the head, because the treaty said it went from the headwaters of the St. Croix to the directly north to the highlands, I believe is what the
Yeah,
terminology.
the line, the vertical line here is supposed to be drawn from the highlands,
Yeah.
straight down.
But there is now a monument up in Amity or somewhere up there. It's called Monument Brook, and there's a monument that says this is the headwater of the St. Croix River, and so that's they've settled that issue.
Cool.
But it was a long time before he went. This was a Wild West here. People didn't know, really didn't know much about their geography. You can claim almost anything and get away with it. Which all countries did, obviously.
Yeah. Well, we still have disputed territory, which is the gray zone where the US fishermen really fight
Out
over
in
it.
the ocean, yeah.
Yeah, out
Oh,
of the ocean.
yeah.
And then the US claim both claim it, so it's yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to draw a line in the water when the water keeps moving.
Good point.
Well, I think there are other countries that have disputes about where the boundaries are
Yeah.
in the ocean
Right.
as well.
But there are ways to do that in terms of how many miles out from the shore you are,
Yeah,
all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, with the terminology when they negotiated these treaties, it wasn't very precise.
No,
Because the islands out in, off the coast weren't worth anything to anybody, and so no one really thought about making, a real precise definition of where those lines ran, and I think the treaty said it went down Joe's Point on some point out in the ocean, which was difficult to define, and so we had to battle over the islands, obviously.
well, there's
And-
one island that still isn't decided.
Yeah.
Belongs to.
Is it
Yeah.
Matthias Seal Island that
that's
they fight
Well,
about?
That's
Yeah.
that's
Where the puffins are, isn't that?
Yes.
It's a little bit of the wild east that's still around.
Yes, the remnants of the wild Northeast.
Well, thank you very much. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Well, we appreciate you attending to us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. It was great to get to give this presentation. I hope you enjoyed.
We did.
Um,
Yeah,
Yeah.
we wish you well. Maybe we'll see your name on some
I'm good.
article 20 years from now, you suppose?
I hope so.
Good.
Are you gonna write anything more about this and pursue it any further, or you haven't decided?
I mean, I may end up writing more about it. I definitely, I think there's a lot more to be explored with the topic, and it's certainly a field that could use some studying. So, who knows?
Do you have a copy of that report from the St. Stephen historian? Maybe she'd like a copy of that.
Oh, I mean, we've got quite a bit of material locally on the Aroostook War.
Yeah.
I can put that together and have Laura do it too. I mean, I'm sure you've seen most of it, but if there's something that you don't have, we can see that you get it.
I'd love that. Thank you.
All right,
All
great.
right.
All right.
Thank you all so much. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you.
There we go.
It's just us.